From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
About 8 people in masks and special equipment rushed on board the ship shouting, "We are from the FSB," gathered the crew on the raft, threatening them with weapons, put them on their knees, and kept them there for a certain period.
A nearby Russian Coast Guard ship with agents masked on board responded. The Russians proceeded to ram and slash the Greenpeace inflatable boats, sprayed the activists with water cannons, and fired warning shots. They detained 2 Greenpeace activists who had managed to climb onto the oil platform.
A day later, armed Russian Coast Guards descended on Greenpeace's main ship, the Arctic Sunrise, using a helicopter and ropes. They reportedly lined up the majority of the 30 activists on board and held them at gunpoint on their knees on the ship's deck. Officials then towed the boat and its occupants to the port of Murmansk, where the activists were held incommunicado and questioned by investigators. On Tuesday, Russia's top investigative agency said it would prosecute the Greenpeace activists on piracy charges. If convicted, the activists could face up to 15 years in prison. On Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin defended the Russian Coast Guard's decision to apprehend the Greenpeace activists. He spoke at an international conference on the Arctic.
It would be better if Greenpeace representatives sat with us together in this hall and told us what they think about the problems we're discussing. They could state their complaints, demands, and concerns. No one is trying to brush them aside. We gather for meetings like this specifically to discuss such problems. It's obvious they are not pirates, but they tried to storm the platform. Our security forces and border troops did not know who exactly was trying to seize the platform under the Greenpeace guise. It's obvious these people violated international law by coming dangerously close to the platform.
Human rights groups have called on Russian authorities to drop the piracy charges. Amnesty International Russia Director Sergei Nikitin said the activists legitimately exercised their right to peaceful protest.
Piracy charges are totally fabricated and do not have any legal basis. They are absolutely baseless. We are calling on the Russian authorities to drop these charges against the Greenpeace activists who used their right to a peaceful protest. Let me stress that the activists who protested against oil drilling in the Arctic did not possess any weapons.
We're joined by Kumi Naidoo. He's the executive director of Greenpeace International. In 2012, he participated in a similar action against oil drilling in the Arctic. Kumi Naidoo, it's great to have you in our studios here at Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
I should say in our LEED Platinum studios, yes. The highest rating you can get in green building.
Yes.
But
congratulations on that.
Explain to us what is happening right now in the Arctic.
As we sit now, the activists are in court. Already we know that 5 activists, 2 from Russia, 1 from Canada, New Zealand and Poland, have already been sentenced to what is euphemistically called pre-trial detention, which is basically detention without trial for 2 months. And the charges that they are being investigated are actually piracy. In the words of one of the people, Denis Sinyakov, a Russian colleague who is the photographer on board, he said, "The criminal activity I am blamed for is called journalism. I will continue doing it." And that captures very well what we're seeing here. This is a disproportionate use of state authority to try to silence off a very important global conversation that needs to be had. Because right now we are reaching the tipping points on climate. The Arctic serves as a refrigerator and air conditioner of the planet. And rather than seeing the retreating of the Arctic sea ice during the summer months as a warning sign that we have to get serious about climate change, sadly, Western oil companies like Exxon and Shell and so on are partnering with Russian state-owned companies to actually go and try to drill for the last drops of oil in this most fragile, remote and risky environment for such activities.
And talk about the Russian decision to begin exploration. How recent is it, and what are the plans in terms of how extensive they expect it to be?
The plans are pretty extensive. It is sadly a key part of the Russian government's economic strategy, actually, to harness the hydrocarbons or fossil fuels in the Arctic. Why this particular facility is important is that even though there are many explorations going on by different companies in different parts of the Arctic, this is the first actual drilling that is about to start. Well, last year when we participated in exactly the same protest, which I was part of last year, they said they were about to start then. Our protests slowed them down by about a week and then they suspended. So why this is significant is that this will be the beginning of a road to disaster if the drilling actually starts. So that's why we put so much of emphasis on this particular facility.
So Kumi Naidu, you did this last year already, you yourself. Talk about that action you did since you experienced it. I certainly remember as we were talking to you hanging off the side of the ship. And so what has happened in this year?
Well, in the course of this year, there was no charges brought against us, by the way. We were very transparent. We never hid anything. In fact, the Russian Coast Guard ship took them 3 days to get there. But once they got there, they just observed and they took a view that we were peaceful. And after we finished our protest, after about 7 days, we sailed away peacefully, no problem. So this is a completely different approach. We don't understand. Piracy, by the way, is a very big international problem as we stand today. To actually bring these charges against us peaceful activists is to trivialize actually the challenge that we have on dealing with piracy, and it is to silence resistance. And the reality is, I know my colleagues who have participated in this action. In fact, a young woman called Sini Sarela, who was with us last year, was the first person to actually get arrested. And yesterday, the Russian Coast Guard themselves released footage of their reading of what they did, and it's horrific. You got Sini Sarela and another activist, Marco from Switzerland, being yanked, and while they were hanging, several meters up, and they're screaming, "We're coming down, we're coming down," and their lives were put at serious risk. And then they started shooting bullets into the water close to where the rigs were. And this is really unnecessary intimidation. We appeal to President Putin and the Russian people as a whole to understand that what is at stake here is not just the world's future, but Russia is actually very much in the firing line of climate change because of permafrost and what changes are happening, which will impact also heavily on the Russian people.
What do you make of the, on the one hand, the prosecutors saying they're going to pursue piracy, possible charges, while President Putin says, well, obviously there weren't pirates in a public forum? Is this differences within the government, or Putin just trying to put on a good face to the actions of his government?
This is a really good question to put to the Russian government, who will be the only people who could answer it with authority. The speculation is that the reading is that the occupation of the ship by the Coast Guards when they came down by helicopters happened in international waters, and that action by the Russian state was in fact illegal in terms of international law. And it might be that they are pursuing the piracy charges because that actually gives them cover from any litigation against them for an illegal act of occupying a ship for no good reason in international waters. That's the only speculation I've heard at the moment, but quite honestly, that's a question only the Russian authorities can answer.
And Kumi, what are the U.S. plans for drilling in the Arctic? They said they're going to release Arctic-specific drilling rules by year's end. Of course, Shell wants to drill in the Arctic.
Well, Shell has actually given the world a very eloquent example of why it is so incredibly difficult for us to even think that it's possible to safely drill in the Arctic. Shell has blown $5 billion of the investors' money over the last 2 years in one fiasco after the other, trying to get to the point of exploration. Shell has now suspended their drilling for this year to try and get their act in order. But I think that it is very misguided of President Obama and the U.S. administration to actually allow this to actually happen. To grant any licenses is essentially yet another step towards accelerating us to irreversible climate change, because the consequences of drilling in this very fragile part of the world is just going to be devastating.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion, and Kumi Naidoo will be joined by Jeff Masters of Weather Underground as we continue to talk about climate change. This is Democracy Now! Kumi Naidoo is Executive Director of Greenpeace International in from South Africa. Stay with us.
We are a rock revolving around a golden sun. We are a billion children rolled into one. So when I hear about a hole in the sky, saltwater wells in my eye. We climb the highest mountain, we'll make the desert bloom. We're so ingenious we can walk on the moon. But when I hear of how the forests have died, saltwater wells in my eyes. I have lived for love, but now that's not enough. Dying, and now I'm crying. Time is not a friend, no friend. As friends we're out of time, and it's slowly passing by. Right before our eyes.
Saltwater by Julian Lennon here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is set to issue Friday its strongest warning yet that climate change is caused by humans and will cause the United Nations General Assembly. And obviously, President Obama spoke this week at the General Assembly. Your assessment of what he did or didn't say about climate change?
Well, he hardly mentioned climate change. And the thing about it is, even the CIA and the Pentagon in 2003, in a report that was given to President Bush, which he chose to bury it, as somebody who was in effect an agent of the fossil fuel industry, that report suggests in the coming decades the biggest threat to peace, security and stability will not come from conventional threats from terrorism and so on, but will come from the impacts of climate change. So if any head of state, any political leader is concerned about peace, security and stability, then they should be using the platforms at the United Nations now to talk about the biggest urgency this planet has ever faced. We are talking here already of serious impacts, particularly in the developing world. We are seeing lives being lost. Darfur, I would argue, as the Secretary General of the United Nations argued, the genocide in Darfur was certainly intensified and exacerbated as a result of climate impacts. Lake Chad, one of the largest inland seas in the world that neighbors Darfur, as largely, to use the words of the Secretary General of the UN, has shrunk to a size of a pond, right? So, and then the Sahel Desert is marching from Senegal to Sudan southwards at the rate of 1 mile a year. So water scarcity, land scarcity, and together food scarcity was the trigger. So when you see all that happening, when heads of state are talking about all these sort of interventions around chemical weapons, all of which are important, but the biggest threat to peace and security is coming already from climate change, and it's going to intensify. So in that sense, I was deeply disappointed that President Obama didn't make that connection.
What could the U.S. be doing right now?
Well, the U.S. needs to recognize, firstly, that they are compromising their economic future, because the U.S. needs to forget about the arms race, space race, and so on. The only race that's going to matter in terms of which countries and companies will be competitive in the future is those countries and companies that get as far ahead of the green race as possible. The U.S. needs to take leadership. The world is hungry for U.S. leadership in climate negotiations.
It's interesting, President Obama in his speech was making the case for how the U.S. is exceptional.
Yes, and the thing about it is, that case, the way it gets read, speaking beyond climate change now, is an approach by the U.S. of do as we tell you to do, don't do as we say. Do as we say, don't do as we do. Because the U.S., if you take on torture, they are signatories to the anti-torture conventions, but we've got waterboarding, we've got Guantanamo, we've got extraordinary rendition on respecting human rights and not violating people's privacy without their knowledge. And, people around the world are saying things like, we had so much of optimism when President Obama was saying, yes, we can, but with all this NSA spying, maybe you were saying, yes, we scan, yes, we scan, yes, we scan. It was seen as it's all about biodiversity.
I wanted to ask you about what's happening in Ecuador. Last month, Ecuador dropped the plan to preserve swaths of Amazon rainforest from oil drilling by having wealthy countries pay them not to drill. President Rafael Correa said the plan to save...
capture and store carbon safely. And the more we deplete our forests, and the rate we're depleting our forests at the moment is every 2 seconds, a forest the size of a football field is disappearing as we speak. So our political leaders, particularly in rich countries who have not come up with the money, I think history will judge them very, very harshly.
A group of leading environmentalists have sent Correa a letter pleading with him not to move ahead, even if the international community failed him, because indigenous people in the area are rising up saying, do not develop this, do not drill here. UNESCO designated the park as a World Biosphere Reserve. It contains 100,000 species of animal, many of which are not found anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. So, I think that underscores the disconnect with regard to getting our priorities right. And also, I think what you're seeing is that so long as the countries who historically built their economies on fossil fuels, the US and most of the developed countries of the world, if they continue to be saying we're going to continue with further fossil fuel projects like the tar sands and fracking and so on, it makes it really difficult for organizations like Greenpeace to actually lobby with developing countries to say you're going to have to leave that coal in the ground and the oil in the soil, when they say but those folks are still continuing. So we are playing political poker with the future of the planet and the future of our children here, and what you're seeing is a terrible case of cognitive dissonance. All the facts are telling us we are running out of time, and our leaders continue as business as usual.
Well, Jeff Masters, I think you're supposed to be on a panel with Michael Bloomberg today on this issue. He certainly has sufficient funds in his own personal bank account to help Ecuador with saving the Yasuna. You might raise that issue to him when you're on the panel. But I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the IPCC report, what we know about it, because obviously it won't be released until tomorrow. What it says about drought and the future prospects for the planet, and specifically how it relates to some of the issues or the conflicts that we're seeing in the world even now, and also about the acidity in the oceans.
Yeah, drought is the #1 threat we face from climate change because it affects the two things we need to live, food and water. And the future projections of drought are rather frightening. I mean, we see large areas of the world, particularly the ones that are already dry, are expected to get drier, and that's going to greatly challenge our ability to grow food there and provide water for people. And I was a little disappointed in the leaked draft that I've seen of the IPCC report. It doesn't mention drought at all in the text. There is a mention of drought in a single table that they have there showing that, well, we're not really sure we've seen changes in drought due to human causes yet, but we do think, the dry areas are going to get drier, and this is going to be a problem in the future. So, yeah, a huge issue. Drought really not addressed very well in the summary. I'm sure the main body of the report, which will be released Monday, will talk a lot about drought. And the second issue you raise, the acidity of the oceans, yeah, that we're sure that we've seen an influence. There's been a 26% increase in the acidity of the oceans since pre-industrial times. And the pH has dropped by 0.1 units. That's going to have severe impacts on marine communities, we think, and it's only going to accelerate. They're saying with pretty much 99% certainty the oceans are going to get more acidic, and it is due to human causes.
On drought, can you talk about Syria?
Yeah. In Syria, they're having their worst drought in over 70 years. And there have been climate model studies done showing that the drought in that region of the world in particular is very likely more probable due to human causes. If you run a climate model both with and without the human increase in greenhouse gases, you see a large perturbation in the drought conditions there in the Mediterranean region. So we're pretty sure that drought is a factor there. And in Syria in particular, I mean, people have migrated. Over 1 million people have had to leave their homes because of drought. They've moved into the cities. They don't have jobs there. It's caused more unrest and directly contributed to the unrest there.
That's an interesting analysis, Kumi.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And others have actually pointed to the big trigger for the conflict in Syria has been climate impacts, particularly drought. But if you look at even Egypt, and you look at all the countries that went through the what so-called Arab Spring, I always say so-called because I don't think the struggle for justice is a seasonal activity, but the Arab resistance, you see in all of those countries there's been water stress as well. And I mean, some of us have been saying for more than a decade now, the future will not be fought over oil, but will be fought over water if we don't actually get it right. I mean, our political leaders must understand people cannot drink oil, that people need. I mean, if you look at fracking in the United States, right, the potential danger that has to water security because of the impact on the water table, it is really taking risks at it. And in South Africa, by the way, Shell is got a contract to start fracking in the Karoo. And again, an extremely water-stressed area to start with. So we really need our political leaders to connect the dots, because basically what you see as a problem is a silo mentality to governance, because we put environment and climate change here, we put peace and security here, we put food and agriculture here. All of these things are connected, and we need, the leadership we need now is leaders who can think in an intersectoral way and understand the connections to the different global problems we face.
And Jeff Masters, once this report is issued, what happens next? And in terms of there are further reports that will come out in early 2014.
That's right. This is only the first part of a big 4-part series. This only talks about what has actually happened to the climate and what the models project will happen. In March, there's going to be a whole nother section which is going to talk about, you know, what are some of the impacts of this? And then there will be a further report. What can we do about it? How can we reduce the impacts? So this is going to take over a year to play out.
Jeff Masters, skeptics are paying a lot just on television. Ever going to start flashing those words climate change as often as they flash the words extreme weather or severe weather?
Depends on what their producer says. They're beholden to what the producer says, and some are on board and many are not.
Amy, if I can just jump in, there's a lesson from history in the United States here that is helpful. If you look at when the scientific evidence around tobacco was clear, and the consensus was clear that tobacco is bad for you, there was still a very powerful lobby of scientists funded by the tobacco industry to actually contaminate the public conversation, delay the policy changes that were necessary, and so on. We are seeing a carbon copy of that same approach. And I would say to the leaders of the fossil fuel industry, also there's another thing you need to learn from. When anti-tobacco litigation started in the early days, the CEOs of tobacco companies were arrogant and said, it'll never succeed. They never took it seriously. Climate litigation is starting now, and the fossil fuel companies are actually being dismissive. I say to the fossil fuel industry leaders, go and ask your CEOs of tobacco companies which is the biggest amount of money that they have to have in the annual budgets today, because it has to be, it's often in the legal department because of the scale of settlements. So I think that one expectation, once the report is out, is that the huge amount of money that goes into lobbying is going to do everything to actually rubbish this report and try and take selectively pieces of information. I think the American people in particular must interrogate the fact that for every member of Congress, there's between 3 and 7 full-time lobbyists paid by the oil, coal, and gas sector. And they have actually held back the possibility of the U.S. being a global leader in renewable technology, and that's going to hurt the U.S. economy in the future.
Kumi Naidoo and Jeff Masters, thanks so much for being with us. Of course, we'll continue this conversation. Kumi Naidoo is the Executive Director of Greenpeace International. Jeff Masters, Director of Meteorology at Weather Underground. He will be hosting Weather Channel's live coverage of the release of the IPCC's report tomorrow. When we come back, Matt Taibbi is with us of Rolling Stone on looting the pension funds. Stay with us.